No, I cannot do it.
Yeah, it's always tricky.
I don't have a controller for it.
Oh, I see another controller video. Unable to connect. Check to make sure you're connected to a stable network that is not blocked by file. I should be using SRVIC guest, right?
Yes. Oh. I don't need to do it.
See if there's any other ones.
I wanted to, I believe it's my password.
No, it doesn't let me in. So then I need to start again.
Yeah, connected it.
Recording in progress. Recording stopped.
Can I send you just the slides, just so that maybe you can share with anybody just watching the thing?
Okay.
Is it? Can I get your number?
Do you want email or?
No, could I do WhatsApp?
Yes, 414 217
Yes, okay, just in Arabic. 414
217
217
7754.
7754.
Yes,
So it's 3 sevens in a row.
yes.
You stream it, the number is the.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to get the streaming right now.
So I can't seem to send it through my. I'm using the WhatsApp on as an app, I can't add you as a contact like that. I just do it as an email.
Okay.
Can I send you? Do I have your email address?
No, I don't think so.
Can I send you the slides just to you? If you put your email in here,
No.
and you can share with everybody else. Yeah, so send it to both of you, and Charlotte could share it with others. Yeah. Alhamdulillah, you're all Huffaz. So if I mention any verse, mashallah, you already know what's before and after it, mashallah. Outdone your teacher. So I love teaching Huffaz because they're like, what's the ayah again? And they know what's before and after. It's very useful. Should I start? Okay, bismillah. Okay, bismillah. You can also join with I don't know if you have the Zoom link.
Well, we do
Yeah,
have.
you should be able to see the slides there as well. Let me go so. Just sometimes easier to see the slides. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So, this class was about a very particular topic, which is when you translate from Arabic to English, what is lost? What is basically impossible to translate? And so last week we were looking at some things which to do with metaphor and simile, which wasn't really an issue of the impossibility of translation. It was just really an addendum to some kind of rhetorical devices in the Quran, right? And so today as well, with this last lesson, I wanted to do it as well. So it's not really, some of it is kind of an issue of lost in translation. Most of it isn't, right? And so I just wanted to mention it anyway because it's just some useful aspects of the Quran. So today's lesson is called No Pun Intended, right? Which is some literary devices in the Quran, right? What is a literary device? Is a something that you use while you're writing or you're speaking to kind of add to what's being said, right? And so what was the main issue that we mentioned, which was playing with variables? So changing the order of something, putting definite when it could be indefinite, putting a verb when it could be a noun. These kind of things are the real subtle things that we see in the Quran and throughout kind of almost every single page of the Quran, and is the real kind of like the strength of the rhetoric of the Quran. Metaphors and other things, they're there and they're powerful, of course, but that is not the main kind of the main thing. And then similarly, literary devices, things like assonance, right? Things like puns, right? Think of a pun, right? We can think of an advert that has like a pun in it. Like, happens, right? Some people say, I don't know, was a football team called the Wolverines. You say, the Wolverines have bitten a chunk out of this team. Okay, well, if they're a Wolverine, they bite chunks out of things, right? That's a pun, right? So these kind of things, these are kind of easier kind of bites that are, if possible, yeah. So that's what we mean by literary devices, right? Assonance, words that all the letters have to have the same letter, like 3 letters in a row, 3 letters in a word, right? They have the same thing. 3 words in a row that have the same letter. So when we're looking at rhetoric, we're looking at what we call the science of balagha in general. We're looking at 3 things. Okay, we're looking at 3 things. Number 1, the big thing, which is ilm al-ma'ani, right, which is the playing around with sentence order, playing around with the variables, as you mentioned. Then we have ilm al-bayan, which is metaphor and simile, these things. And then we have what's called al-badi', which from the word badi' means something cool. Right? Abda', you came with something really fancy and nice. Right? Allah is badi'u samawati wal ard. He's the one who does all these amazing things in the heavens and the earth. Right? So this is what we call literary devices. Right? And it is the lesser of these 3 things. But again, I mentioned it in general. And so these break into 2 categories. They break into sounds, so that you just listen to what's happening and you hear something funny or interesting or novel, or the puns, things that happen to do with the meaning. So when I say, for example, the Wolverines took a bite, if you don't know what Wolverine means, there's no sense to it, because bite and Wolverine, Wolverine is a carnivore, therefore bite. It goes together. As opposed to what the Wolverines were worrying about. You don't know what Wolverines mean, but you hear wah, 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 right? And so this is the sound, right? So these are called muhassinat al-lafdiyya and muhassinat al-ma'nawiyya. Playing with the sound or playing with the meaning, right? And most of what we look at today is playing with the sound. So classic example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَوْمَ تَقُومُ السَّاعَةِ يُقْسِمُ الْمُجْرِمُونَ مَا لَبِثُوا غَيْرَ سَاعَةٍ. So you hear this in English, I don't know what's being said, but you hear the word sa'a, sa'a, right? So what's being said in Arabic is it says, on the day that the hour happens, i.e. as-sa'a, the final hour, the criminals will swear that they had only been around for an hour, sa'a. So this is a pun with the language. So what happens is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, people will think that they were only alive for a short time. Okay? Jazakumullah khair. He emphasizes it with the fact that it says they will swear by the case. Okay, so they will swear by the case they were only around for a short time. But then doubly compares these two things by connecting on a sound level. So in terms of what's being said, you are connecting these two things. Yes, it said that on this day they will think they were only alive for a short time. But then how is that comparison emphasized? By connecting it with the sounds. Right? And often a sound of something makes it sound right. Right? You know, often we have emotional logic. You know, for example, let's just make it 500. It was 499. What's the difference between 499 and 500? 500 looks nice. You know, you just like it. Right? It just feels comfortable. Right? And so suddenly we're gonna increase something by something that you like. Something sounds nice. It is convincing, even though there's no logic to it. Right? There's no actual logic to it. Right? So these are emotive proofs that are based on sound. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what's the important thing is the sound shouldn't be the only driving force. So if it only sounds good, but there's no logic to it whatsoever, or it doesn't flow, or there is takalluf in it, it's just you're doing it too much, then it doesn't sound right. Right? And so this is particularly noticeable if you look at Jahili poetry. Jahili poetry is very, very smooth. Right? Whereas there's a whole period, for example, in the Abbasid period, where they start using lots and lots of these things. It's kind of artificial. No one understands what you're saying, but you're just trying to throw in lots of words that sound really good, but they don't make any sense. Right? And so in the Quran, it's always, the muhassinat al-lafdiyya always come with and around the other thing. It's there as a part of the device, and it's not the only tool that's being used. So that's an example there. The word hour and hour, as in the Yawm al-Qiyamah versus the time. Right? So this is what we call al-jinas at-tam. Al-jinas at-tam, they're the same thing, and it's exactly the same sound, used for two different meanings, right? Okay, يكاد سنا برقه يذهب بالأبصار يقلب الليل والنهار إن في ذلك لعبرة لأولي الأبصار. So the same word being used twice. So it says the brightness of its lightning almost blinds, so that's the word in English, but really takes away eyes. He turns night into day. In that there is a huge lesson, ibrah, for people with eyes. So if you have eyes, you will look at the lightning and see how the lightning is a danger for you, but a huge benefit because rain comes. And you see night and you see day, and you see harm and you see good, and you see the whole creation and safety and danger, and you see all these variations. And in that, if you have eyes here, you will understand, right? So the clear kind of pun there, eyes and eyes. Like one of my teachers, he was the former mufti of Mosul, and he was a poet. And so somebody comes up to him and says, teach me the science of prosody, al-arud, ilm al-arud, which is a poetic meter. How does poetic meter rhyme? Every single poem has a rhythm, right? So the science is called ilm al-arud with an fatha on the ayn, al-arud. So the student comes up to him and says, Sheikh, teach me ilm al-urud. Teach me the science of urud. So he says, don't worry. He says, it's not a problem. فَإِنَّهُ سَهْلٌ لِمَنْ فَتَحَ اللَّهُ عَيْنَهُ. For whoever Allah opens his eye, Allah will make it easy for him. I.e., if you know how to pronounce the word, it's ilm al-arud, not ilm al-urud, it's going to be much easier, right? So this is a kind of a pun, right? And these people are like that. So these are kind of, these kind of puns. وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. Right? Aslan, if you look at the whole Surah Al-Rahman, it's all rhyming. And. Right? The only part that doesn't rhyme is كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ. Right? Sha'an, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is engaged in some tremendous matter. But the rest is an. Okay, why is that the case? It's because actually many of the Arabs didn't pronounce it sha'an. They pronounced it shan. Right? You say shan ilahi, right? In Urdu, like some big matter, shan, right? So it does rhyme if you just pronounce it differently. Like Ya Rabban Nas Adhibil Bas. Now Rabban Nas Adhibil Bas. Right? The word is bas. Right? You can say bats or bas in Arabic, but if you say bas, then it actually rhymes. Right? So the whole thing rhymes. So the whole thing clearly is there is a rhetorical power in rhyming. It also says and. So that's an example of hasanat lafdiyya, right? Just the sound of it makes sense, right? As much many of the Quran, which the Quran does. But anyway, it has the word وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. So the word mizan is used, three times. He says, وَالسَّمَاءَ. The fatha tells us that there's a verb before it. So it says, and he raised the sky. He raised it. So the word raise is twice in Arabic. It only comes once in English. Okay? Where does it come in Arabic? The fatha. If you said, وَالسَّمَاءُ, it would mean something else. But وَالسَّمَاءَ, you've now told me that there's an implied verb. Right? So he says, and he raised the sky. He raised it and he established the balance, al-mizan, eye of all things, that you might not transgress in the mizan, eye of good things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put everything in order, don't mess the world up. Right? So weigh justly and do not cheat people in the mizan of good things. Right? So you see this word mizan. So you're connecting all these levels of being, the universal level of being, of how things are in life and things, and then in your trade, etc. Right? Mizan, mizan, mizan. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the world perfectly, so don't mess it up. But then how do you connect the word mess up and the world? Okay, I'm not sure how to do that. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did it by using the same word, and then suddenly it's now connected. And you connect all these things on two levels, on a sound level and on a conceptual level, or the message. Right, وَهُمْ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ وَيَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ. So this is what's called al-jinas al-naqis. So you have jinas al-tam, the self-same sound, as opposed to a semi, it's almost the same sound. Right? And so again, by having a similar sound, you connect the two concepts and it becomes easier. وَهُمْ يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ وَيَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ. Right? And yet they tell others not to listen to him. They prohibit others from listening to him. They tell others don't listen to the Prophet. And they distance themselves from him. So connected these two ideas. يَنْهَوْنَ عَنْهُ يَنْأَوْنَ عَنْهُ. وُجُوهٌ يَوْمَئِذٍ نَاظِرَةٌ إِلَى رَبِّهَا نَاظِرَةٌ. Right? So many of the Arabs, they find it difficult in pronouncing the dad. Right? So I remember my degree in Jordan, they had this graduation kind of quiz, and for, I know people who were teaching at schools or whatever it was, and they're particularly interested, do you know the difference between dad and va? Because for many Arabs, if not most, they're the same thing. They say wala dhali, that's just how they say it. Ana maghdub, right? So it's a very, it's very common. So here we have these two words. وجوه يومئذ ناظرة ضاد إلى ربها ناظرة. Almost the same word. Right, so it says certain faces on that day. So that was the indefinite, remember? Wujuhun means faces, but it's indefinite, so it means here certain faces, i.e. certain faces will be like this, but other faces won't. So there's an implied message that there are other categories of faces. Right? On that day will be shining, looking at their Lord. Right? So the words shining and looking are not connected in English, but they are in Arabic. Right? So they're nadira, they're shining, and they're going to be nadira at the Lord. So the question is, how can you see Allah if He's not an object? So we discussed this before, but it's worth discussing again. Right? How can you possibly see Allah if He's not an object? What do you think? So seeing, we know seeing is the following. If there's no light here, you won't be able to see me because photons bounce off me and they bounce into you. Into your eye, and then you process it, turn it upside down, etc., and you call that seeing. So how is it possible if will there be photons bouncing off Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Yes, the closest explanation one can give given our reality is.
Okay, so basically, so you're saying that it's something that is beyond our minds and we can't quite understand it. Fine. Okay. Any other explanations? Why can't we just say it's metaphorical?
We see.
That you can't see Allah. Right, why can't we say, so here, there's another word, ala, means blessings. The single of it is ilah. So certain ulama, they came along and they said, obviously you can't see Allah because it's not an object. So when the Prophet ﷺ told us in many, many hadiths, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us in here, it's all metaphorical and it means you're going to see Allah's blessings because you couldn't possibly see Allah, right? Now why is it problematic? It's problematic because there's nothing logically wrong with seeing Allah. It just doesn't normally happen. So the process makes sense, right? The process of reading a hadith or reading a Quran and saying, well, it can't be this because that doesn't make sense, therefore this. The process is in principle valid, but the ingredients used in that conclusion are wrong. Okay? Just that we're not going to say they don't believe in the Prophet or they don't believe in Allah. We say you assumed incorrectly that you can't see something that's not an object, but you can. It is conceptually possible, even though it doesn't happen today, it is conceptually possible to see something that is not an object. Right? And so here we had three camps of the ulama. Some ulama, they came along and said, oh, it means you're going to see Allah's blessing, you're not going to see Allah himself. Right? Which again doesn't really make that much sense because it's there in the Quran, it comes in the hadith, it's fairly clear in the hadiths. Right? It's quite an extreme approach. Right? The other approach is Allah must be an object. Because if you can see him, he must be an object. Right? Which is also a problem because laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like Allah. Right? So these two camps, we don't consider these to be orthodox, don't consider them right. We consider these people to be Muslims, and they had these opinions, and that's fine. But if you know, they don't say that Allah's like us. They just said that Allah's an object. That doesn't necessarily mean He's like us, right? So these two camps, we respect these people, and that's fine. But they don't consider that to be orthodox belief. And the Sunni Islam is we will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah ta'ala, if we die in Iman, right? We will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yawm al-qiyamah, but without any particular how, without any particular medium. So the medium that we use today to see things with light bouncing, it doesn't have to happen like that. Right? Basically, Arthur's answer in a roundabout way. Right? But the issue was expressing it. So this is what we have to understand is that there's many things that were kind of understood in the heads of the Sahaba, but took time to be expressed. You know, when Ibn Umar is asked that question, do you have to pray witr or not? And he says, well, the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba did it. What does he mean by that? It took a long time for, let's say, Hanafis to come along and say, there's such thing as wajib, and there's such thing as fard. Okay, what does that even mean? Well, fard means you have to do it, and if you debated it, you wouldn't even be a Muslim. Whereas wajib means you have to do it, but we accept that there might be some debate. Okay. But that's quite a refined discussion that the Sahabi would not usually use. In his head, that's the idea. He understands like, okay, I'm not saying you have to do it, but you can't do it. So ideas and refinement of ideas they could be in your head, but for you to express them, with you put on paper and to define, often takes a long time, right? And so this is one of these things, is that the Sahaba, they didn't discuss things like this. The Salaf didn't even discuss things like this. But over time, people started saying, well, Allah's like an object, and Allah's like this, and Allah's that. I said, no, okay, what do you mean then? Right? So that took time for people to, you know, for this debate to be refined, and to people to establish exactly what is an artist's head. I don't mean that, and I don't mean that. Okay, what do you mean then? So that's just a side point. Okay, here, this is a kind of a use of the language. So in Arabic, we have different dialects, right? Right, we have Hadarak Masri, صح? Masri bardu? Right, so imagine, for example, I'm Egyptian, right? And I'm speaking to my Egyptian friends, and I say, al wa ult wa kada, and then I start saying qal. Why do you do that? If I start saying qal, it's like I'm speaking Shakespeare in English. I said, وَلَقَدْ قُلْتُمْ, and you start laughing. Because you say ult a, right? Whereas the opposite, if I'm in Jordan and I'm speaking to somebody qult a, qult ish, and I say qult a, now I'm suddenly thinking that maybe I'm mocking somebody. Right? Like my daughter, she hardly knows that she left Jordan when she was 2.5. She still says to this day from her teacher at school, أقول right? Which means that I'm telling you, I'm going to tell you off, right? And so every dialect has used, but it brings a certain flavor, a certain thing in your mind, right? If I'm speaking a proper Urdu, and then I start speaking Punjabi, and then I start speaking Mirpuri, it's like, there's a particular reason why you're doing that, right? Or if I was going to speak English as they speak where I'm from, right? I'm from a place called Hereford, right? So the way they pronounce Hereford, where I'm from, is Euroford. They don't say come here, they say come Europe, right? So if I gave the whole lesson like that, you'd think, is this guy joking? Or is he trying to say something? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does the same thing in the Quran. He takes different dialects of the Arabs and uses one here and one there, because it has a different flavor, it does have a different sense, right? And so we have, for example, a phonological problem, which is doubled letters in Arabic, right? Doubled letters in Arabic. So you have a verb like marra yamurru, has two R's and it's quite heavy, right? So in many places, right, in the past tense, they would not say marartu, I passed by, because that's quite difficult, it's quite a mouthful. So what do they say? Is, for example, in Egypt, marrit, right? Marrit, shaddait, right? You don't say shaddadtu, that's very difficult. So there's a problem in Arabic morphology called the double letter, right? So we have a verb here, yartadda, 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 right? How do you use it in the majzoom? How do you use it if I want to say, for example, yastami', yartadid? Do I say yartadid? Then I have two dals and it's very difficult to pronounce. So here, if I was to put another verb in its place that had two separate letters like yastami', may yastami' minkum, it'd be easy. But yartadid, can you say yartadid? Like, how do you deal with that? And so the Arabs themselves, the Jahili Arabs themselves, they had two different ways of dealing with the double letter in a scenario like that. Some of them merged and some of them separated. So in the East, in the Najd, they used to say man yartadda, man yamurra bi, right? Man yamurra bi. هذا الحديث لم يصح. Whereas in Medina and Mecca, they used to say لم يصح هذا الحديث. ومن يرتدد عن دينه. ولم يمرر, right? من يضلل الله ومن يضله الله. من يضلل الله, right? Yudlil is a mouthful, right? And so what we find is these two dialects existed, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses both of them in the Quran in different places. Is Allah going to use the mouthful, heavy, difficult word, or the easier word, right? And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ يَرْتَدَّ مِنْكُمْ عَنْ دِينِهِ فَسَوْفَ يَأْتِي اللَّهُ بِقَوْمٍ يُحِبُّهُمْ وَيُحِبُّونَهُ أَذِلَّةٍ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ أَعِزَّةٍ عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ يُجَاهِدُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَلَا يَخَافُونَ لَوْمَةَ لَائِمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word yartadda, which is the easier version. Hence I translate it, and whoever turns away from his religion, the slightest bit. You don't want to pray in the first row, don't worry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring other people. You don't want to memorize the Quran, Allah will bring Hufaz. Yes, it's your job as a community member to make sure the deen is happening, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will look after his deen. If you don't want to study fiqh, you don't want to study seerah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring from China some person who has just become Muslim yesterday who will specialize in seerah and gather all the manuscripts in Topkapi and Uzbekistan that are being buried by whatever, and he will preserve the religion. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, lillahi fi khalqihi shu'un, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is running the show, and he has people that are doing things for him. Our job is to try and be those people, but if we're not, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring other people. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, if you turn away from, whoever turns away from his religion the slightest bit, may yartadda, Allah will soon bring some actual men. Qawm. Qawm means men. From the word qam yaqumu, to stand up. Right? Qawm and nisa. Rijal wa nisa. Right? So guys, if you're not going to be actual men, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring some actual men. Whom He will love, and who will love Him. Soft on the believers, hard against the disbelievers, who will fight in the way of Allah and not fear any blaming word of anyone who may blame them. They couldn't care less. Like say no, right? Couldn't care less, that kind of attitude. Right? Like, was it Sheikh Kishk, right? Famous scholar, Egyptian scholar, right? He was, every Jum'ah he would give a khutbah and then be taken away by the mukhabarat, the secret police, right? So once he's leading the prayer, did I tell you before? No. So he's leading the prayer and he's like, second row and third row, please straighten your lines. It's like odd. Second row and third row, please straighten your lines. Like why don't you say front row? He says, oh, they're all secret police. I don't need to tell them anyway. So he couldn't care less. Like he's going to know he's going to come down the minbar and go to jail. It's not a problem. Right? Alhamdulillah, couldn't care less. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring people like that. Jazakallahu khairan, right? You know, people bring people like that, right? And we don't need to. Yes, it's our job to vote for people who are good and to try and do that. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there will be a time, right, when things change. So مَن يَرْتَدَّ. Notice, let's compare it. وَمَن يَرْتَدِدْ. The self-same word, self-same grammatical thing, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses dialect now of Mecca and Medina and not the dialect of the Najd. وَمَن يَرْتَدِدْ مِنْكُمْ عَنْ دِينِهِ. So what was before? You don't want to do the religion 120%. Don't worry, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring other people. Here's a completely different thing. He says, وَمَن يَرْتَدِدْ مِنْكُمْ عَنْ دِينِهِ فَيَمُتْ وَهُوَ كَافِرٌ. أي ردة. One is turning away from the sunnah and following 120%. This is, you want to leave Islam completely? مَن يَرْتَدِدْ. Different sense. The same word, same root letter, same everything. Right? Same grammatical role, but use two different dialects. Right? وَهُوَ كَافِرٌ فَأُولَٰئِكَ حَبِطَتْ أَعْمَالُهُمْ فِي الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. Right? So it says, whoever well and truly abandons his religion, khalas, I'm not a Muslim anymore. Right? An important thing, we have to understand that you're a Muslim until you are 120% not Muslim. So just because you drink, just because you have a girlfriend, just because you never go to the mosque, you're still a Muslim. Right? So unfortunately, the shaitan comes to certain people and they say, oh, but there's this hadith and that hadith is true. Right? When the Prophet was talking about real iman, you're not a real Muslim if you don't treat your neighbor well. You're not a real Muslim if you commit zina. Yeah, you're not a real Muslim, but you are a Muslim. So the shaitan comes up to the person and says, no, but you're not really a Muslim. So you might as well just leave the religion completely. That's a trick from the shaitan. Right? And also for us, we have to be careful not to label other people as kuffar. Right? Sometimes there are people who have crazy ideas, particularly Muslim, mashallah. Right? Masr, right? Dunya thaniya, right? Something else. And so you're going to find crazy ideas. People who say things like, subhanAllah, this person's a believer, but as long as you have 1 ounce of possibility that they believe in the Quran and Sunnah, they're a believer. Right? You don't just say, oh, well, they did this, they're a kafir. Right? So we shouldn't have this kind of trend. Takfir is the job of the qadi and not the job of the mufti, nor is it the job of anybody else. So the mufti looks into it and then refers the case to the qadi, and the qadi says, yes, this person has left Islam. Right? Not for me and to you to say they're a Muslim or not. Right? And his deeds of those people have come to absolutely nothing in this life and the next. So notice, yartadid. One's heavy, one's a mouthful, i.e. it's apostasy, they have left Islam. Right? وَمَن يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولِ. So same thing, يُشَاقِق وَيُشَاقِ اللَّهِ. Right? How would you pronounce the word shaqa? Yushaqu, lam yushaq. How do you pronounce it? Do you split the two qafs apart? May yushaqiq, or do you use yushaqi, like that? وَمَن يُشَاقِقِ الرَّسُولَ مِن بَعْدِ مَا تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ الْهُدَى وَيَتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ نُوَلِّهِ مَا تَوَلَّى وَنُصْلِهِ جَهَنَّمَ. وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا. So this is about what? This is about various things, but it applies to somebody who goes against ijma'. So whoever disobeys the messenger after guidance has been made clear to him and follows other than the way of the believers. You say, okay, believers in the 1st century, did they believe in hijab? Yes. 2nd century? Yes. 3rd century? Yes. 4th century? 5th century? Okay, what now? Mas'ala khilafiyya. Suddenly now it's a debate. Subhanallah. Right? Suddenly now it's a discussion about something that was never a discussion. Right? Prayer means focus. As long as you're focusing in life, you're praying 5 times a day. As long as, even at work, if you just focus on Allah, you're doing salah. The salah, that's what it means. Like, excuse me, has anybody ever said that before you? No. Okay, jazakumullah khair. Right? If there's debate, bismillah. Anything that's debated, go by all means, let's research it, let's have a discussion. But if there's no debate on this issue, then وَيَتَّبِعْ غَيْرَ سَبِيلِ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. This is one way, this is the way of the believers, and this is some other way. Right? So you go off. So we shall turn him wherever he so turns, and roast him in hellfire, and sad indeed that is as a final end. Right? And so again, it's important to understand that just because you say something that's crazy doesn't mean you're a kafir. So there's 2 things. Somebody has a fatwa that's just nuts. Just like the craziest fatwa I've ever heard. In the West, you don't have to pray. Oh, you're a kafir? No. You're not a mufti. Or you're an imbecile, or you're a jahil, or whatever. Call me anything you want, but don't call them kafir. Because at the end of the day, they just don't understand. Right? And for those who read Arabic, there's a very important book called Riddatun La Aba Bakr Laha, which is about the modern in the Middle East and about apostasy in the Middle East. And it also applies to Pakistan and other places where people are just confused. And they're sick of Islam because they see such weird pictures of it. And they're like take off the hijab, do this, do that. They still want Islam, but it's just really weird. And they say things that don't make any sense. And they confuse people. Right? خير. ذلك بأنهم شاقوا الله ورسوله ومن يشاق الله. Notice exactly the same word. يشاق الله, يشاقق الله. Right? Do you say يشاقق, which is really heavy, two calves right next to each other? Or do you يشاق الله, which is easier? فإن الله شديد العقاب. That is because they disobeyed Allah and His Messenger, and whoever disobeys Allah, verily Allah's punishment is severe. So one is talking about going against ijma' and going completely off the other direction. The other thing is disobeying Allah. They're not the same. So we have the self-same word used in two different places with a different pronunciation, so to speak, different dialect being used to show that the different sense of what's going on. Okay. And subhanAllah, this is a very profound ayah because the two dialects are used in one verse. So imagine if I said, it doesn't matter if you go here or there. Now, why did you do that? Why did you pronounce it one way and then another way? There's obviously a reason in the same sentence, right? That's what's going on. So that's what we see in one verse. In tamsaskum hasanat. That's very heavy. Tamsas, right? Sayyidina Maryam uses the same thing. Walam yamsasni bashar. So you can just understand this: a young girl who has been told this crazy thing that you are going to have a child, and she's trying to kind of beg logic there, but I'm not a bad person, I've never done anything bad. Lam yamsasni bashar, a man has never touched me. So the intensity of her voice comes out in the fact that yamsas as opposed to lam yamassani. Right? So lam tamsaskum, in tamsaskum hasana. The sound is difficult. So should a hasana, something good, so much as touch you in a difficult or weighty way, تسؤكم, it saddens them. وإن تصبكم سيئة يفرحوا بها. And so here we see Tamsas, which is the dialect of the Hijaz, of the dialect of Mecca and Medina. Tamsas, it's called Fakkad Idgham, splitting the two scenes. And then you see Yadurrukum, which is the dialect of Bani Tamim in the Najd, which is merging the two ra. So here there should be La Yadurrukum. So what's happening there? So look at the translation. Should a single good thing so much as touch you, it saddens them to the core. Where'd you get that from? Tamsas. It's like right in their very being. It's hard for them. But if something befalls you, some bad befalls you, they will rejoice at it. But if you show patience and fear Allah, their plotting and planning will not harm you in any way or sense whatsoever. Where does that come from? It comes from the says shay'a, which means at all. Okay? And it says la, not at all. But then here, this verb yad, it should be la yadururkum kaydum shay'a. It should be really heavy. Allah says, no, the word isn't even heavy, it's light. Even the light darar won't happen. It's like wala dararan khafifan. If you have taqwa and patience, it's not going to be a problem. Right? Like Sheikh Kish as well. He's in jail and they set dogs on him. Dogs don't eat him. Didn't do anything to him. Taqwa, right? Again, I'm not making a political statement. Right? Everything I say and will and will say does not reflect the message. I was giving a talk in Norway, and I actually had to sign a piece of paper like that. Anything that I say does not reflect the mosque. Alhamdulillah. Add that, make what's it called, a note to the board. La yadurrukum. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the slightest possible phrase as saying that even a darar khafif will not even afflict them. If you have taqwa, right? And tasbih. So why? Because nobody can harm you. As long as you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no one can harm you. Why? Because you're not dealing with people anymore. So what is the real harm? Is the harm that you see that person harming you. So Atif is abusing me, insulting me, ruining my life, doing all these things. And I wake up in the morning, I have nightmares about him. The problem is I see Atif and I don't see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala behind, it's like, what's the big deal? Right? The hadith when the Prophet ﷺ sleeps under the tree and puts his sword hangs the sword on the tree, and he's lying down, and then the kafir comes along. Says, who's going to protect you from me now, O Muhammad? What does the Prophet ﷺ see? He doesn't see somebody about to kill him. He sees Allah creating him and holding him in existence, and holding the tree in existence, and holding the kafir in existence, And so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-mani' and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-dar, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-nafi'. And so He doesn't see, there is only one nafi', and there's only one dar, there's only one benefiter, there's only one harmer, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the hell that people cause us is our own hell that we create for ourselves. Is our ghafla from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, lack of taqwa and not seeing things. That's pretty hard, right? It's pretty hard to see that, but that's our issue. So that as long as commensurate with the strength of our iman is how much Jannah we will live in this dunya. That's the thing. It's not seeing the harm or whatever it's seeing that's coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So should a single good thing, we mentioned that. Okay, وَمَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ أَن يَهْدِيَهُ يَشْرَحْ صَدْرَهُ لِلْإِسْلَامِ. ومن يريد أن يضله يجعل صدره ضيقا حرجا كأنما يصعد في السماء. So notice here, in Arabic, we normally say يَتَصَعَّد. يَتَصَعَّد. Like يَتَزَكَّى or whatever it is, right? Now, we can also merge the ta in yeta, words that begin with a ta, you can merge them with many other letters. Right? So here the ta in yatasa'ad has been merged with the sad. Okay? So what does that do? How does it sound? Yasa'adu. Yatasa'adu yasa'adu. Yashaqqaqu yatashaqqaqu. Ithaqaltum il-ard tathaqaltum il-ard. The merging, the shadda creates the shidda. Right? The shadda, adding more shadda in that letter gives just more intensity. It's a very intense word. So let's look at the word. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever Allah wishes to guide, He opens up his chest to Islam. Whoever He wishes to send astray, He makes his chest tight and constricted, as if he were scaling up into the sky. It's difficult when you go higher and higher and higher, you can't breathe because the air density is less. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encapsulates that difficulty of breath in the merging of the ta and the sad. Yes, adu is difficult to breathe. Right? So the word itself, yatasa'ad, tells us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that somebody who Allah sends astray is like somebody who's going up into the sky and it's difficult for them to breathe because of the difficulty there. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then merges the ta with the sad as well to reflect that same thing. Right? And there are countless examples of this. Yeah, muzammil, should be mutazammil, but muzammil. Right? Many examples of this. So this is a muhassinat lafdiyya. Right? You've tweaked the word a little bit based on Arabic language to give a sense of what's going on. Right? It's very, very brilliant. Here we have something that's called al-mushakala. Mushakala is when we have two words, you use one word for another word because in this scenario, not in reality, but in this scenario they're alike. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَزَاءُ سَيِّئَةٍ سَيِّئَةٌ مِثْلُهَا. And the recompense of a sayyi'ah, somebody kills somebody cuts off someone's arm, sayyi'atun mithluha, is they have qisas, they have the right to do the same thing. Now, the first is an evil act. When somebody kills somebody, that's an evil act. That is a sayyi'ah. Justice is not a sayyi'ah. But it's used, the word sayyi'ah is used twice to show that it has to be exactly the same. So they said in the past, for example, let's say I got a knife and I stabbed Atif in a certain way. If he is not capable of surgically doing the same thing on me, meaning it's not scientifically, it's not surgically possible, particularly back in the day, medieval, right? A medieval kind of medicine, you're not allowed to do it because it's not exactly the same. So you can't say, well, too bad, right? No, they'll say things like this. Let's say, for example, you cut my hand off and I didn't die. So I'm going to cut your hand off, and if you die, it's your problem. Then that's different, because you cut my hand off, I can cut your hand off. That's different. But here we're talking about you, for example, let's say you did a certain type of stab, and the surgeon says, I can't do the same thing. It's too difficult, like a gunshot. How am I supposed to repeat? How am I supposed to do exactly the same thing? Like it's not possible, right? Like subhanAllah, my friend, he's an emergency doctor, ER doctor, and his friend had a patient who literally walked into the triage, and like, oh, I've been shot in the head, and he had literally been shot in the head, here, and the bullet just miraculously went through all the tissue that's not even used, and he's alive. He's just bleeding, but he's alive. Now, can you do that to somebody? you can't do that. So if it can't be exactly the fair, then you can't do it, right? Right? You can't do it. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the same word to say it has to be exactly the same, right? Even though the second word is not actually a bad deed. This is a type of majaz in reality. فَمَنِ اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ فَاعْتَدُوا عَلَيْهِ بِمِثْلِ مَا اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ. Right? Whoever transgresses against you, then transgress, quote unquote, i.e. do the same thing against them in the same way that you transgress against them. And so it's important to understand that in the Jahiliyyah, part of when you say jahl, what does jahl mean? It means exactly the opposite of this. Right? So jahl means you don't know something, right? But it also means jahiliyyah, the sense of jahiliyyah is being like the phrase in American English, bad. Like, I'm so bad, you don't want to mess with me. Like, you don't want to mess with me. If you do anything, I'll mess you up big time. That's it. That kind of attitude was a praiseworthy thing in the Jahiliyyah. That you are a person, nobody wants to mess with you. Right? So as Zuhair ibn Abi Sulma, he describes this person in the story who restarts a feud, a blood feud between people. And he says, what is it? لَدَى أَسَدٍ شَاكِ السِّلَاحِ مُقَذَّفِ لَهُ لِبْدٌ أَظْفَارُهُ لَمْ تُلَقَّمِ جَرِيءٍ إِذَا لَمْ يُبْدَأْ بِالظُّلْمِ يَظْلِمِ. Right? He says, you're standing in front of a lion. This man is not a man, he's a lion. شَاكِ السِّلَاحِ مُقَذَّفِ. He's fully armed and he's built like this. شَاكِ السِّلَاحِ مُقَذَّفِ لَهُ لِبْدٌ. He has a mane. وَأَظْفَارُهُ لَمْ تُلَقَّمِ. And his claws are very long. تلقيم الأظفار, to cut your nails. جريء, he has a lot of jur'at, right? You say that word jur'at, right? He's very bold. إذا لم يبدأ بالظلم يظلم. If you don't do anything wrong to him, he'll do wrong to you first. Right? This was a praiseworthy thing. Right? He also says in the same poem, he says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَذُدْ عَنْ حَوْضِهِ بِسَلَاحِهِ يُهَدَّمْ وَمَنْ لَمْ يَظْلِمِ النَّاسَ يُظْلَمِ. Right? He says, whoever doesn't defend his pool, meaning his women folk, it will be destroyed. If you don't have ghayrat, right? If you don't have ghayra, right? Then you're going to be abused. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَظْلِمِ النَّاسَ يُظْلَمِ. Whoever isn't bad and doesn't treat people bad, you're going to be wrong. So it's important for you to basically to wrong other people, and that's how you can defend yourself, right? Preemptive strike. This was a praiseworthy thing to the Jahiliyyah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came and said, no. The ghayrat is good, having a ghayrat for your family is good, but you can't wrong people if they have wronged you. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, this rhetoric comes many times in the Quran. No, you can't do that. That was praiseworthy in the Jahiliyyah, but no. Wine was praiseworthy in the Jahiliyyah. Why? Because it was about karam. Grapes in Arabic are called karm, with a sukoon, karm, right? From karam, generosity you spend. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, yes, but in good things, not in bad things. Feed the poor, but not in that kind of thing. Spending your money in wine for other people is not a praiseworthy thing. So what do we see? We see semantics. What was it? We saw most of what we saw in this class. I think the first 6 lessons were what? Flipping things around. Indefinite, definite. That's the big thing. Definite, indefinite. These are the real things that are lost in translation. And then we mentioned other things like simile and metaphor, etc. And we did those things. And literary devices, which could either be with sound, i.e. the sounds that we use, or meanings. Right? So we gave the example in the sound was, where were the wolverines? Were, that's the sound. Or the wolverines took a bite out of the other team. Oh, that means biting and being a wolverine, that's the meaning, right? So I'll just give a few examples of this in the Quran, there's many examples. But وَمَا نَقَمُوا مِنْهُمْ إِلَّا أَن يُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَمِيدِ الَّذِي لَهُ مُلْكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the only valid reason that they had for punishing them, well, this is with Ashab al-Ukhdud, putting the people in the trenches and burning them, right? Was the fact that they believed in Allah, the Mighty and the Wise, who owns and controls the heavens and the earth. Huh? And that obviously isn't a valid reason. So you say the only valid reason you have to do something is X. But that whole thing is not a valid reason, i.e., you have no valid reason, right? The only reason, the only valid reason you have for taking taking this from me is because it's mine. And that's not a reason, therefore it's not a reason. So this is a playing with the meanings, not with the sound. Is you put something structurally, conceptually in a place where it's a valid explanation for something, and it's not an explanation, right? It's similar a bit like in English when we say pigs might fly, right? So pigs might fly. That's not a good example. The better phrase is what is it? The phrase is the Pope Catholic? I don't know if you use this in American. So Atif says, "Oh, Frieding will go to Jummah tomorrow." I say, "Is the Pope Catholic? Is the Pope Catholic?" Like, yeah. I.e., it's so obvious that the Pope is Catholic that you shouldn't have to ask me the question, "Are you going to go to Jummah tomorrow?" Right? So you put one thing next to another. So this is so obvious, therefore that's so obvious. Right? That's a kind of to do with. It's not to do with the sound. It's to do with the concept. Right? Similar kind of thing. احشروا الذين ظلموا وأزواجهم وما كانوا يعبدون من دون الله فاهدوهم إلى صراط الجحيم وقفوهم إنهم مسؤولون. So here we have a number of it is to do with words as well. But we have, for example, it says, gather those who did wrong, i.e. kufr, along with their spouses. So azwaj can mean spouses, right? It can also mean those of their ilk, those of their same kind of thing. Right? It doesn't necessarily mean because the spouse might not be the same, right? And all that they used to worship besides Allah. So in Arabic it doesn't say besides Allah. So this is besides Allah. It says min dunillah. Dun means beneath. Right? So from Allah and beneath. That's what min dunillah means. So angels, prophets, anything else. You used to worship these things. Anything other than these things. Guide them, the pun, right? Guide them. So here it's not the sound. The sound of guiding doesn't go with hellfire. But the pun is you guide somebody to paradise, you don't guide them to hell. So guide them to the path of hell. And stop them. Oh, alhamdulillah. They're saved. وَقِفُوهُمْ. Pause. Right? So that's why the qari, you should pause there. وَقِفُوهُمْ. Alhamdulillah, they're saved now. MashaAllah, they're not going to hellfire. إِنَّهُمْ مَسْئُولٌ يَا رَبْ. Right? It's the opposite. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, stop them. As if they're saved. Because they're going to now be questioned. It's the opposite of what you'd imagine. Right? So guide them to what? Paradise? No, to hell. Stop them. Oh, they're saved? No. Now they're going to be questioned even more. They're going to have even a greater punishment. Right? So these are playing with concepts as opposed to playing with sounds. Right? Right. Allah. So these are the semantics, metaphor, and simile. And that's all I have for today. I don't know what time we're on. Is it 25 past already? It's 25. What time is the Isha? So let's cover, we have some things from 12 minutes. We have some things from last week which we didn't finish. Just try and find it. Can I just pause the... do you mind if I pause this for a second? Just because I don't want to show my whole screen. How do I do that? Of course, unplug it. There we go. Where was it? So things from last week which we weren't able to cover. We're talking about comparisons and simile. We did this. Parables. We did this one. We did this one.
You did the one which you said was not appropriate.
Yeah, we did that. That was right early on there, but we did this as well. So this was, we were giving examples of implicit comparisons, right? When you say, for example, the man waddled into the room, right, as if he's a duck. So waddling goes with a duck. So therefore, I didn't say he's like a duck, but when I said waddling, it sounded like a duck. or mashallah, I started the engine and it was purring happily, as if it was a happy cat, right? And so this is an example of, so this is called al-isti'ara al-makniya, and so personification in English is like that, right? So personification is when you compare something inanimate like a car to something animate like a cat. But what if it's the other way around? Right? What if I say, for example, I don't know. Yeah. So he printed off some food. So a printer prints off food, but I'm saying that when he served the food, it was almost like a printer. So I'm comparing him to a printer. That's the opposite. When you're comparing something animate, alive, to something inanimate, right? But that's for us. That's also for us, meaning in Arabic literature. In Arabic literature, it's also called isti'ara makniya because it's just comparing one thing to another thing implicitly. That's all. So personification is a very particular type of implicit comparison. So we gave this example. وَلَمَّا سَكَتَ عَنْ مُوسَى الْغَضَبِ, when anger stopped speaking to Musa. So obviously it's a thing that's on his shoulder speaking to him, right? So in the comparison, imagine if there was something on your shoulder, something that's on your shoulder has quite a lot of control over you emotionally and what's happening with you. It's always telling you to do this, telling you to do that, right? So as if there was this thing that's there whispering into his ear. بل نقذف بالحق على الباطل, but we throw truth against falsehood. So presumably if you throw it, it's an object that can be thrown. Smashing its head, i.e. the head of falsehood. So presumably falsehood is some kind of animal. So there is this thing called some kind of stone or I don't know, cannonball that's being thrown and hitting this animal, and it smashes its head, it's dimag, it's smashing in its head, so therefore it must have a head, and then it slithers away, right? And that's what, as if it were some creature with a head and a body. So that's not there in the Quran. It doesn't say as if it were some kind of thing, but that's what's implied in the Arabic. هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها. So it says he is the one that has made the earth a zalul. Zalul, it means a domestic animal. فامشوا في مناكبها. So then go and walk around on its shoulders. So imagine the earth is now this camel, is this cow, and you're walking around using it. Right? So this is not only is it implicit comparison of the earth to a domestic animal, so just like an animal could probably kill you, right? Many domestic animals could kill us. Like sheep probably can't kill us. Right? I have a funny joke about that. We can tell that later on. But a ram, for example, right? A ram is a dangerous animal, right? A bull, a cow. A cow is just, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just has made them that we can control them, but they could probably kill us. A horse could kill you quite easily. Right? A camel could definitely kill you, not a question, right? But here Allah has made this powerful thing at your service. So go and walk around on its shoulders. You use it as you will, right? So that's an implicit comparison. This will then be emphasized. So this is what we call an isti'ara al-makniya al-murashaha. An implicit comparison that has then been strengthened even more by other words that strengthen that idea. ضربت عليهم الذلة والمسكنة. Right. So it says, lowness and wretchedness have been stamped on them as if they were something that could be stamped on something. Right? Lowness and wretchedness. ضربت عليهم الذلة والمسكنة. Right? These were some of those things. Okay. And so, okay. So when we talk about parables, parables can either be X is like Y. The believer who spends his money on orphans is like this. We come up with a picture, right? Or it could be a metaphor as well, right? So when is it metaphor? In that there is no X is like Y. There's just one thing, right? For example, what's your name? Muhammad. So Muhammad says he wants to come and, for example, wants to come to Brentwood and study something, and he's like, "Oh, I'm going to come next week and study." I'm like, "Okay, I'm waiting for you." He doesn't come. Next week, he doesn't come. And he said, he calls me on the third week, and I say, "As-sayfa ضيعتي اللبن." He's like, huh? Why are you talking about as a female? ضيعتي is for a female. Why are you talking about milk? right? So I'm calling it, it's a phrase which means you lost your opportunity, right? As-sayf al-dayati 11, which goes back to a story of a woman who was married to a man, and he was old, and she didn't like being married to him. So she said, I want to marry somebody else. He's like, fine, go ahead and marry him. He was younger, but didn't have any money. And so then it was the winter time, and they didn't have any food. And so she goes back to her ex-husband and says, oh, can you help us? He's like, hey, in the summer, you lost your chance. It's either me or him, and you don't come knocking my door now when you wanted to marry somebody else. Right? So I say to him, as-sayfa dayati 11. Nothing happened in the summer. There was no milk or yogurt or anything. And what are we talking about? But it's a phrase. So I didn't say X is like Y. I'm not saying you asking me is like this. I'm just throwing it like that. So now it's a genuine metaphor. Right? They turn into idioms. So if it wasn't well known, it would be a metaphor. But then it becomes what's called an isti'ara at-tamthiliyya. And then it turns into a method. And then it's frozen in time. Yeah. So it's an idiom. Like he kicked the bucket. Right? So like what bucket? What you mean is he died, and it is like somebody who was hung and there was a bucket under their foot, and then the bucket was removed, and then he died. Okay. So now, but I don't mean he was hung, and he didn't even commit any crime. I just mean he died. So here's an example which is arguably debatable. It says, "Inna aradna al-amanata ala as-samawati wal-ardi wal-jibali fa'abayna an yahmilnaha wa ashfaqna minha." Right. So this is just one interpretation. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Right. We offered the opportunity, i.e., of bearing the trust of iman and moral responsibility to the heavens and to the earth and to the mountains, but they refused to bear it and they were scared of it. Right. So either this is haqiqah, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala genuinely offered the opportunity of taklif, of moral responsibility to the heavens and the earth, and they said no, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave it to mankind instead. Either that's reality, or it's what? It is the responsibility, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, this responsibility of iman and obeying Allah is so great that if we were to offer it to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, they would refuse it and they would be scared of it. Right? So it's almost like it's just a turn of phrase, a way of expressing. It's as if this happened, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say X is like Y. He just puts the whole thing in there one go, but what is meant is it is as if that's the case. Now, can we say this is the case? We don't know, right? Because the very important thing is that when you claim that something is majaz, when you claim something is metaphorical, you have to have something called a qarina, something that's there, right? That gives that sense. So you say, MashaAllah, I'm gonna lead the prayer today. And well, who leads prayers? You lead people. But we all know that it doesn't really mean that, because nobody leads a prayer. Not the prayer is going to be behind you, is it? It doesn't mean that. So it means you're going to lead people in prayer. Okay. So there's something there that tells you don't literally mean this, you mean this. But can I come along and play with what you're saying? Can you do that? Like Atif says, oh yeah, Frida, we like you. No, you don't mean it. How do you know that? Oh, I know that because I saw your messages. Okay, you have a qarina, right? But otherwise you're just changing someone else's words. Can you do that to the Quran? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says salah, it means this. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means wattini wa zaytun, means Hassan and Hussein, mashallah. Where do you get that from? That's called al-batiniyya. These people, al-batiniyya, people just change things as you like, right? And just interpret things as you like, and that's not valid. You have to have evidence. Why is it that you said this verse doesn't mean this, or this word doesn't mean this? There's something called haqiqah and majaz, the normal meaning and the metaphorical meaning. You can only depart from the haqiqah to the majaz with some kind of evidence. So here, say, free, what's your evidence? Allahu A'lam. Leave it as it is, right? But it's possible, right? It's a possible interpretation. فقال لها والأرض ائتنا طوعا أو كرها قالتا أتينا طاعين. So again, similar kind of scenario. Did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala literally say to the heavens and the earth, come willingly and unwillingly, or unwillingly? And did they literally then talk to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, we come willingly? Or is it His power, Allah's qudra, is such that if He were to say to it and to the earth, come willingly or unwillingly, they would both reply, if that happened, we come willingly, because nothing can restore His might. So is this a tamtheel? Are you trying to show a picture of his qudra, or are you saying actually what literally happened? And again, it's possible because we don't know. Well, I wasn't there, and you weren't there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can talk to whoever or whatever He wants. So Allah knows best, but just as a process. Right, so those were those last examples, I believe, from last week. If anybody has any questions or queries, this is the last lesson, inshallah ta'ala. No questions or queries? Jazakallah khair. And I encourage everybody, inshallah, who doesn't know Arabic, to please start learning Arabic. It's very important. And if you learn Arabic, and bit by bit, things like this do open up. Some people, unfortunately, I remember once, a long time ago, my friend was learning Arabic, he says, what's the point? I'm never going to understand the Quran like this. Right? So, well, who has qudra? Do you have qudra, or does Allah have qudra? Right? So many people who started learning very late in their 40s and 50s, they understood a lot. Mufti Ali Gumar, right? I think he was 40 when he started studying, 40, 35, something like that. He didn't study as a young man. Quduri, the author of Mukhtasar al-Quduri in Hanafi fiqh, started in his 40s. Right? Many people started when they were late, and they, ليس العبرة بمن سبق بل بمن صدق. Right? The point is not who comes first. The point is who is true. Right? So inshallah, Allah, ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us for our shortcomings and to reward my teacher, Sheikh Ali Hani, who is a specialist, is a kind of a world-class specialist in tafsir. And this is just a kind of a drop of some of the things that he taught us. Subhanallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.